Well, hey guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Red Shadow here, and I'm going to try to keep this brief. I'm a little bit behind on the news, of course. This was announced a few weeks back, and I'm going to probably have a cheeky title for this video. E3 is canceled, and I don't really care. Well, that's just because that's how I feel. I really don't care that E3 has been canceled. Now, maybe it's just because E3 the last couple of years, especially with COVID, but even going back a little bit before that, to when like Sony stopped doing their own thing at E3 and Nintendo just kind of did the directs. E3 hasn't been the same in a while. I think that stuff is pretty obvious, but I should also point out and talk a little bit about my history with E3. So E3 started, I believe, in 1995. In that time frame, I was heavily playing games. That was the transitional period for me, going from like Super Nintendo and Genesis to the original PlayStation and eventually N64 and all that. I was reading, the internet was around back then, but it wasn't commonplace in the house. So gamers like me were reading magazines, EGM, GamePro, Tips and Tricks, PSM when the PlayStation was popping up, and plenty of other ones. Video game magazines were just the thing, they were the shit. That was how you got all of your information. You held a magazine in front of your face and you read these little articles that talked about games in Japan. They talked about games that are coming out. They had reviews for games. Reviews for games have been going on basically since the 80s. Everybody thinks that it's like IGN and the internet era that reviews are out there, but that just puts them in front of more people. We were reading about games in magazines. I had a magazine that reviewed one of my favorite games of all time, Mega Man Legends, and then the next month they had to issue like a sort of retraction because they had an early build of the game that wasn't exactly what was going to be on store shelves. That's really what put Mega Man Legends in front of my eyes for the first time, and it became one of my all-time favorite games. But that was what we got our information from, was video game magazines. And all of those video game magazines in that June, July time period would report on E3 after E3 came out. To a guy like me in like his late teens and early 20s, E3 was this thing that took place on the other side of the world practically, even though it was just on the other side of the country. It was this big corporate conference that, I mean, even back then I understood that all those companies got together and they were showing off their products to retailers and to magazines and to journalists or whatever, even if the journalist part wasn't necessarily what they were, wasn't like the initial point of it all. They were there covering it. All those magazines were going to be covering it. And once it got into the late 90s and into the 2000s, the internet websites, and then eventually the places like YouTube and all that, as you got into the later 2000s and into the early 2010s, I was aware of things like giant enemy crabs and My Body is Ready and all this kind of stuff. I was aware that there were these shows and they were exciting and people were doing stuff with them. But E3 was not this thing that was put in front of me that I could digest and consume as a consumer until I discovered YouTube in like 2012 and 2013. Some of the first E3 hype moments that I really ever were exposed to was in like 2013, when they had some of the stuff about here's how you share a video game with your friend, because Xbox wanted to do an online thing and all games had to be registered online, and if you sold a game to a friend or you bought it from a used store, you had to pay a thing and do all this other stuff. And Sony was just like, you want to lend a game to your friend? And then it was Shuhei Yoshida and Adam, I can't remember his last name, Boyes, something like that, and they just handed the game to each other, and it was like mic drop. Sony had multiple things like that. I think going all the way back to the PS1 and the Sega Saturn, the Sega Saturn announced the price and it was a lot. And Sony just came in and said that theirs was like $100 cheaper, and just the guy walked off the stage. Like, those are cool moments, reveals for games, you know, left and right. The giant enemy crab thing, of course, was a big one. That was that was memed on for years afterwards. But there was a ton of that kind of stuff. But for a guy like me, I consider myself to be a pretty average gamer. I'm not a competitive or professional gamer. I don't work in gaming in any sort of way. I just worked in retail, so I could touch all these different games when they came into the stores. But like anybody else, I had to pinch my pennies or take games that I had already beat or didn't like or whatever and trade them in so I could get the next thing that I wanted. Getting information on stuff wasn't 24 hours a day, all consuming. I got it every month. I got my different magazines subscriptions, or I picked them up off the magazine racks at the stores. And like I said, I would read about E3 that one time a year, but I wouldn't be thinking about who's going to be at E3. What's the thing that's going to happen at E3? That stuff wasn't in my mind until, like I said, when I could get on YouTube and I could watch a conference. But that started in like that 2013, 2014 time period. I've got a video on my channel about how the 2015 E3 made a liar out of me, kind of, sort of, because at that time I was saying I wasn't going to get a PS4. I didn't want a digital future. I didn't want DLC and day one patches and pay-to-win mechanics and microtransaction bullshit. So I was like, I'm not going to do it. And then E3 2015 blew my freaking mind. Like, 2016, 17, 18 all have really big moments when it comes to PlayStation. You know, I'm PlayStation-centric. But 2015 was the one that really did it for me. And that was when I started to care about E3, because I could sit down and watch it. But the thing that's happened over the last few years, especially with the COVID and the pandemic and all that, was a lot of these companies who were having to spend exorbitant amounts of money to rent spaces in these convention halls and hotels and ballrooms and you know, stadiums and whatnot. In the digital age, they could make a digital presentation. Whether anybody appeared on screen or not, or there was a host or something like that, didn't matter. They could present it, put it together, package it, edit it, and then release it when they wanted to, and people would still watch it in droves. I mean, when I watch the new State of Plays or showcases, Nintendo Directs, E3s, Games Fest, Opening Night Live, Game Awards, like any of that kind of stuff, when I watch them on YouTube live when they're happening, I can look at the numbers there and see that hundreds of thousands of people will be watching those, sometimes millions. And it's done without anybody having to be in a hall, without anybody having to spend all that money. Obviously, these companies are going to want to save money wherever they can, and this is one of the ways that they can do it. But you know what? It's still hype as hell. I don't even currently have a Switch right now, but the February Nintendo Direct that they did blew my mind as somebody who couldn't even play some of the games that I was seeing. Watching people react to the Nintendo Switch Online getting Game Boy and Game Boy Color / Game Boy Advance games, and then busting right into Metroid Prime Remastered, which we've been hearing about for years, was like amazing. And then they showed Level 5 coming back with like 3 games in that thing. And even that's hype for me because I like Level 5. I like some of the stuff that they've done in the past. It was cool to see them sort of come back. The main reason why I wanted to sit down and do this video was because all I was hearing there for a couple weeks was so much pissing and moaning and depression and sadness and like people just completely, I don't know what the right term, I guess, to say is, but people were just completely brokenhearted that E3 was going away. Something that didn't happen 2 years ago, something that last year it happened, but it was a digital-only event. Then this year it was supposed to be a digital and in-person event, and then they had to cancel the in-person, and then they eventually just canceled the whole thing. They say that they're going to try again next year, but Jeff Keighley already has all of his established things, and his events, in my opinion, have been pretty good. The thing about E3 was that it was collated into one period of time. There'd be like Microsoft doing something on Sunday night, and now they do it with Bethesda, but like Bethesda would have something in there, EA would have something, Nintendo, Sony, they'd all have these, you'd have 2, 3, 4, 5 nights or days of all these big conferences and whatnot, that we as the gamers and the consumers could take part in digitally, or you could go to it. I would never go to one. I've never been to one. I would never go to one in person. My anxiety would not allow me to go into these places with thousands and thousands of people all over the damn place. Even for something that I love more than just about any other pastime or passion in this world. But watching it on YouTube and Twitch and all that kind of stuff, it was nice to be like, okay, tonight we get this thing, and then tomorrow we get that thing, and you get to see how all these different companies try to like top the next company and what they're trying to offer, and give you all kinds of hype announcements. And I've already talked, I think, before in a video or two about how I get upset about how people react to certain things that's worthy of being in this thing, but that game isn't, and they kind of shit on these game developers and publishers for the little things that they show. But I don't really want to get into that. I always loved how everything seemed to be so hype, but you knew that Nintendo was going to drop this thing to try to get the buzz and the headlines, and then Xbox is going to have their thing, and Sony's going to have their thing, and then the companies like Ubisoft and EA and Bethesda and all them, when Bethesda was separate from Microsoft, might not have something to really rival those, but they would still have something that would be cool. If you're an Assassin's Creed fan, if you're a Fallout fan, if you're a fan of specific franchises, you're going to get something at those developer and publisher conferences, and it would be one big potpourri of really awesome and amazing stuff. But it was still kind of subsiding over the last few years, and then of course, like I said, the pandemic stuff factors into it as well. But I feel like those companies and the industry as a whole adapted well by doing their own digital showcases, and then they can just come out on Twitter, and they can just come out on IGN or someplace like that, and they can say, we're going to be doing a showcase or a state of play, a presentation, a direct on this day and at this time. Tune in and watch it live, or watch the VOD later on. A lot of times I had to do that because I would be working when those things would happen. And those things were sufficient to me. Now, maybe part of the reason why I don't care is because, like I said, the industry has adapted well, in my opinion, and Jeff Keighley obviously really come through on things as well. But I have this whole routine with all of these things. I come to YouTube and I watch the actual presentation for myself to digest and consume on my own. But then I have anywhere from like 5 to 10 to sometimes even 12 to 15 different YouTubers or outlets, news programs, podcast reactions, yada, yada, yada. And it allows me to delve deep into just sort of like the community factor of it. Like if I was sitting on my couch with 3 or 4 or 5 other people watching it, and we're all in unison being like, yes, that's awesome. And for the retail job thing and all that kind of stuff, and for being a gamer myself, also watching those presentations over and over again multiple times, it sort of like ingrains a bunch of that stuff into my head. It gives me the opportunity to be able to tell people, yes, this thing is coming, here's what's going on with it, here's when it's going to be, here's what platform it's going to be on. It just gives me, in my opinion, some information that somebody who only watches it once or doesn't watch it at all is not going to glean from, an IGN article or a quick, news blip on some podcast that they watch or listen to. That's a small thing. That's just a me thing. But that's just something that contributes towards my attitude of I don't really care that E3 is going away, because E3 is still kind of out there. It's just not called E3. It's not ran by the ESA. And it's spread across the entire year by all of the different console makers, publishers, and developers. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. That's really just to sort of get it out of my own head and display it somewhere out there on the internet for posterity. I don't want to shit on anybody whose disappointment is really real and palpable for the E3 thing, but it just doesn't really make that much of a difference for me, because I think the industry has adapted to it, and I think the way that I consume it, the way that I take in all that information and revel in the celebratory nature of just individual conferences or presentations or whatever. It's enhanced what was there before. It's made it better, in my opinion, in some ways, in most ways. And I just can't complain about that. And I just won't. I'm not gonna sit here and relegate myself to depression and being upset over it. I say we just move forward and see how it all works out, how the State of Plays and Directs and the Jeff Keighley presentations will carry us through. And maybe E3 does come back next year. Maybe the companies will actually get with ESA and ReedPop, they were going to take over and do E3 this year. Maybe they'll be able to put it out there and it'll be like the old days. I don't think so, but who knows? Alright, well anyway, that's my thoughts on that. I'll shut up now and I'll see you in the next video.